Greetings, friend. I'm truly pleased you've chosen to spend a moment here. If you feel like subscribing, that would only add to my joy. But enough of that. Let's get right into the story. Above the crowd, the chandeliers sparkled with an almost mischievous gleam, as though they were in on a secret no one else knew. At the threshold of the opulent Whitmore Estate ballroom stood Ethan Callahan, impeccably dressed in a deep navy suit, subtly adjusting his cufflink like a man rehearsed in restraint. All around him, guests drifted beneath the crystal fixtures, their laughter mingling with the soft clinking of champagne glasses. Elegantly dressed in couture gowns and tailored tuxedos, they moved like they belonged. But Ethan hadn't come to indulge or to socialize. He wasn't there to toast to success. He was there for one reason: to witness the woman who once wore his ring step into a spotlight tailored for her alone. The same woman who once dismissed his quiet steadiness as boring. The same woman who'd left him behind, rewriting their story with herself in the starring role. Delilah Monroe. She gleamed beneath the lights like a piece of art behind glass, elegant, poised, untouchable. Her gown hugged her like a whispered secret, and her fingers curled possessively around the arm of her new fiancé, Chase Whitmore. Chase looked like he'd stepped out of a movie, handsome, polished, and wealthy enough to make headlines. Delilah's laughter rang out, clear and practiced, bouncing off the marble and slicing into Ethan's chest with surgical precision. He used to find comfort in that laugh. Now, it felt like a blade. She'd cast him as a footnote in her saga, the bland office worker left behind while she blazed forward. Tonight was her coronation, and she wore the crown proudly. She had no idea that the man she'd tried to erase had returned, not to win her back, not to beg, but to stand tall, seen for who he'd become, unapologetic, unyielding. He studied her like a familiar monologue, every gesture and line already committed to memory. Her presence was too polished, too curated. Ethan recalled a different Delilah, raw, vulnerable, mascara smudged at dawn. He remembered her sobbing into his chest after failed investor meetings, remembered paying bills she couldn't, and making midnight pasta while she rehearsed for dreams bigger than their apartment. But that version of her didn't exist in this ballroom. She'd peeled away those layers long ago, and Ethan by choice had faded into the crowd. When he finally moved forward, a ripple passed through the room. Faces turned. Surprise flickered in the expressions of those who knew his name but had forgotten his face, like her cousin, and the man who once mocked him as that assistant guy. They didn't know what had shifted, but they sensed it instinctively. Ethan no longer lingered in the shadows. Delilah stepped onto the stage as if the spotlight had always belonged to her. She radiated gratitude, her tone syrupy and precise as she thanked the crowd. Then, predictably, her gaze landed on him. "And over there," she announced sweetly, gesturing with faux affection, "is a blast from my past. Ethan Callahan, my ex-husband. Probably still filing paperwork in some cubicle in D.C. Laughter rose around them, tidy and pointed. Ethan didn't blink. He didn't smile. He simply raised his water glass, locked eyes with her, and waited. The laughter faltered. She hadn't realized. Not yet. No one in that grand hall knew what Ethan Callahan had become. The courtroom victories, the confidential cases, the nights spent buried in evidence while she posted motivational mantras for her followers. She'd never asked about his life after the divorce, never wondered. But now she would. Chase approached him, extending a hand and flashing a polished grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "So, Ethan, what do you do these days?" His voice carried the tone of someone expecting a joke. Ethan looked to Delilah, catching the smirk tugging at the corners of her lips. She was waiting for the punchline. He gave her none. "I'm a federal prosecutor," he said. The air turned still. The buzz of the room dulled in an instant. Delilah's glass slipped from her fingers, shattering at her feet. There was no gasp, no dramatic outburst, just silence, heavy, brittle, and thick with reevaluation. Ethan extended a sleek business card toward Chase. Ethan Callahan, U.S. Department of Justice, Major Fraud Division. The words struck like a verdict. Delilah's face drained of color. Her mouth moved, but no sound escaped. She tried to laugh it off, tried to act unfazed. But Chase was no longer smiling. He was watching her closely now, brows knit with doubt. The illusion had cracked, and Ethan stood at the break, not with bravado, but with certainty. The ballroom went still. He didn't need to elaborate. The phrase federal prosecutor lingered in the air, untouchable and final. Delilah remained motionless, a glittering statue beside her picture-perfect fiancé. Her once stunning dress seemed gaudy under the weight of reality. The self-assurance that carried her moments ago evaporated in the presence of a truth she'd never bothered to prepare for. She had been the star. Now the silence belonged to Ethan. Every pair of eyes turned to him. She stood exposed beneath the lights she had once commanded. A server froze mid-step. Glasses clinked awkwardly onto tables. Even the musicians seemed to lose their rhythm. Delilah crouched, pretending to gather shards of glass, but her trembling hands betrayed her. Chase leaned in, a protective hand on her back, uncertainty replacing admiration. Then he turned to Ethan, his voice guarded. "You're with the DOJ, but she told me you worked in admin." Ethan inclined his head. "That's one interpretation." Delilah stood slowly, grasping at composure. "I wasn't lying," she blurted, her voice unsteady. "Ethan never shared much about his job. We were growing apart. I didn't press. He didn't tell." Chase didn't look convinced. Not anymore. Ethan stayed quiet. He had no need to justify anything. His silence was its own kind of statement. Around him, the faces that once laughed at her stories shifted, now tinged with guilt and confusion. They weren't just seeing a man transformed. They were seeing a narrative fall apart. Turning back to Chase, Ethan spoke with calm precision. "I handle high-level financial crime. I've prosecuted 5 federal cases in the last 4 years." He paused just long enough. "One of them involved your father's former partner, if I'm remembering right." Chase stiffened. Ethan didn't break eye contact. "While Delilah chased likes and curated captions," he continued, "I was chasing down justice." Delilah let out a tight, awkward chuckle. "Let's not make this a courtroom drama. It's a celebration." "You turned it into a hearing," Ethan replied coolly. "You handed them the crowd and asked for laughter." The chatter had died. Glasses once lifted mid-laughter now sat untouched. Even those who had roared at Delilah's cruel joke about her ex seemed to shrink, their eyes fixed on the floor as though searching for an escape. Chase's jaw tensed. "You told me he sorted office supplies, that he had no ambition, that he was insignificant." "I wasn't," she began, reaching for him. He withdrew, each step deliberate. "You made me believe you'd let him go," he said, voice low but resolute. "But all you did was make him small enough to leave behind." Her lips parted, yet no reply came. "I'm not here for a scene," Ethan said quietly, emerging from the attention that had begun to settle on him. "I came because I was asked, and maybe, for once, I wanted people to actually see me." He turned toward the bar. The silence lingered after him. Delilah stood frozen, clutching her purse like a lifeline. Slowly, people began moving, but not toward her. They gravitated to Ethan. The dynamic had shifted. Later, Ethan remained near a dim wall, eyes on Delilah as her once polished veneer started to peel. There was no triumph in his gaze, no arrogance, just stillness. The crowd no longer orbited her. The shift wasn't loud or obvious, but it was unmistakable. A couple who used to fawn over her fashion walked past without acknowledgement. Her sister Jenna stood tense, arms crossed, clearly torn. Stay loyal or step away before the wreckage pulled her under. Nearby, Delilah's father, Franklin Monroe, was motionless near the exit, pale and silent. This was the same man who'd once scoffed at Ethan's presence at family gatherings. Now, he couldn't meet Ethan's eyes. It wasn't merely embarrassment. It was consequence. And for Ethan, The hardest part was realizing how long he'd let the lie stand. Conversations had taken on a new pitch. Ethan's name, once absent, was now the thread weaving through whispered dialogues. He led the Milford investigation. He was on Bloomberg. She told us he pushed papers. Delilah heard it all. Every word landed like a bruise. Eventually, Chase made his way to Ethan again, this time stripped of bravado. "She wasn't honest with any of us," Chase said, looking hollow. "Even about how you met. She said you were just convenient." Ethan didn't flinch. "She wanted someone who made her seem louder." Chase exhaled. "I should have realized, but I didn't." "You weren't supposed to," Ethan replied. "That's how illusions work." There was a beat of silence. Then, with a reluctant tone, Chase added, "You were the lead attorney on the Westmore case." That was national news. Ethan gave a small nod. "She told me you were still applying for assistant manager gigs." "She said a lot," Ethan said. Chase frowned. "Why didn't you ever correct her?" Ethan took a measured sip of water. "Didn't expect to be put on trial at a celebration." That coaxed a humorless laugh from Chase. He shook his head. "She said you were boring. I was dependable. She said you never stood up for her." Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "She mistook quiet for weakness. But tonight she learned, when quiet men speak, people listen." Chase looked toward the corner where Delilah now sat alone on a velvet bench, anxiously scrolling through her phone. He didn't approach. He didn't need to. By the bar, Lorraine Whitmore appeared beside Ethan. "You never raised your voice," she said softly. He looked at her. "And yet," she continued, "you changed the entire room." A faint smile played on his lips. "The truth doesn't need volume." She nodded slowly. "You didn't come to humiliate her. You came to remind them. They never really knew you. That's a rare kind of strength, Mr. Callahan." She stepped away, leaving him beneath the chandelier's glow, still, poised, and at last seen. Across the room, Delilah watched, no longer the star of the night, but a woman desperate to revise a narrative she no longer controlled. Perhaps she never had. The lighting remained steady, but the energy had shifted. Something had cracked open and everyone felt it. Delilah Monroe, once radiant, now sat rigid in her gilded gown. The dazzle had dimmed. Her practiced smiles looked forced. The woman who used to hold every gaze now couldn't fill the silence. Ethan leaned against a marble pillar, arms loosely crossed, scanning the room. He wasn't basking. He wasn't bitter. He was simply present. The room had recalibrated around him. The man they had dismissed was now its axis. Eyes followed him, some intrigued, others ashamed. The earlier gossip had quieted to murmurs. Glances toward Delilah were quick, uneasy. Even Jenna, once openly skeptical of Ethan, now lingered at the edge, jaw tight, assessing the fallout. A man in a navy jacket approached tentatively. "You led the Milford fraud case?" Ethan nodded. "She said you were in admin." "I was," he replied evenly, "right after filing federal indictments." The man blinked, then walked away. Near the dessert table, Franklin Monroe sat by himself. The same man who used to introduce Ethan as Delilah's driver now stared at him, silent, unreadable, but something heavier stirred in his gaze. Guilt, maybe even fear. Delilah's invented version had finally collided with reality. And standing in that truth, unshaken, was Ethan. He didn't need to confront Franklin. His presence did it for him. Back at the bar, Chase still hadn't touched his drink. He hadn't said much since the unraveling began. His fingers tapped quietly against the glass, the rhythm echoing the pace of his thoughts. Delilah, having pulled herself together, approached. Her heels clicked against the floor, sharp in the quiet. She laid a hand on Chase's shoulder. "Can we talk?" she asked softly. He turned. Whatever warmth he'd once held for her was gone. "You didn't just lie," he said quietly. "You made me a part of it." Her voice quivered. "That wasn't what I meant." "You turned him into a joke right here, in front of everyone. Why? To feel powerful?" She tried to answer. Nothing came. I trusted you, he continued, every word deliberate. I stood by your version of things, and now I see. You made me look like a fool. She attempted once more to speak, but the words wouldn't form. There was no way to spin it now. Her eyes drifted toward Ethan, still standing calmly across the room. He didn't look smug. He didn't speak. He simply met her gaze. And in that look, something shifted. For the first time, she truly saw him. Not as the background character in her story, but as someone whose silence had always held more power than her performance. As dusk deepened and the crowd dwindled, Ethan slipped outside to inhale something real. The night air greeted him with a brisk honesty, stark against the suffocating performance inside, where smiles were curated and sincerity was scarce. He shut his eyes, allowing the breeze to sweep over him like a truth long withheld. Then, a voice broke the silence. Ethan. He pivoted. Jenna Monroe stood a few paces away, her face unreadable, her voice clipped and restrained. I just wanted to say... She paused, wrestling with the words. You were pretty clear. Ethan didn't reply. Her voice softened, as if something in her had deflated. I always assumed you were just... spineless. Like you lacked courage. Still, he said nothing. I see it now, she admitted. You weren't weak. You were quiet. He offered a subtle nod. Silence doesn't equal absence. She regarded him for a long second, then turned and disappeared back through the doors. He remained. Too many years had passed with others sketching the outline of who he was supposed to be. Tonight, he let reality do the talking, and finally, people were listening. Inside, the party sputtered forward. A mellow track trickled through hidden speakers. Laughter returned, but it was thin now, calculated more than carefree. The kind of laughter that papers over discomfort, not joy. Waitstaff circulated again, this time with desserts. Flashbulbs popped. But on the edge of it all, Delilah Monroe sat alone, idly twisting the edge of a napkin. Ethan lingered in the shadows, saying little since the moment of reckoning. He didn't need to. His silence had carried more weight than any speech Delilah ever gave from a spotlight. That's when Franklin Monroe stepped forward. The same man who once overlooked Ethan at a political fundraiser now approached with a measured pace, shoulders stiff. His voice was low. Ethan. Ethan raised his eyes. Mr. Monroe? A long, deliberate silence settled between them. I misjudged you, Franklin finally confessed. Ethan's head tilted slightly. It wasn't really your judgment. You were echoing what she wanted you to see. Franklin looked down. Even so, I should have... You believed the version of her that sparkled, Ethan cut in gently, yet firmly. But you never questioned whose light she might have been standing in. There was no rebuttal. Franklin gave a quiet nod and turned away. Later, Chase appeared on the balcony where Ethan stood, the city stretching out like a living mosaic in the distance. It's over, Chase said, his voice stripped of emotion, almost resigned. Ethan didn't react. Chase leaned on the railing and let out a deep breath. She spun a story around you, and I believed every word. She needed that version, Ethan said calmly, the one who stayed small. Chase glanced over. Why didn't you push back? Because truth doesn't plead, Ethan said. It waits its turn. Chase stared at his hands. She built herself up by burying your silence. Ethan shrugged faintly. She only looked elevated because I stayed beneath her. Chase blinked, as if the honesty landed harder than expected. Then he asked the one question Ethan hadn't anticipated. Did you ever really love her? Ethan looked back toward the skyline. I loved who I believed she was. She only ever loved her own reflection, mirrored in my quiet. Chase nodded somber. She's going to hate that she couldn't shatter you. She never had that kind of power, Ethan replied unfazed. Then Chase extended his hand, not for a shake, but as a mark of respect. Thank you, he said, for not destroying her. You had every chance. There was no need, Ethan said simply. She handled that herself. Inside, Delilah made one last approach. Her steps faltered slightly, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. Ethan. He didn't move. "I didn't really know you," she admitted. He met her eyes. "Number you just never cared to. I thought I needed more." "You craved chaos," he said. "I gave you calm." She hesitated, lips quivering. "Can we talk? Just the two of us?" He shook his head. "This wasn't about conversation, Delilah. You brought me here to shame me." Tears began to gather, glistening at the corners of her eyes. "You've changed." "No," he replied evenly. "I just stopped pretending." She stood still, speechless. For once she had no spin, no performance. He didn't linger. He walked past her, not with anger, but with clarity. She didn't follow. She understood. The loss had already happened. The night continued to unravel. The once glamorous gathering now resembled the aftermath of something scorched. Ashes lingered in the air. Glass caught the light from scattered angles. The applause was gone, replaced by a silence too loud to ignore. Ethan Callahan stood near the grand entrance of the Whitmore estate. His phone vibrated faintly in his coat pocket. He didn't reach for it. He already knew. Delilah probably, maybe Jenna, possibly even Franklin. But it didn't matter. He gave the ballroom one final glance. Delilah sat crumpled in a corner, her phone in hand, with no audience left to captivate, no spotlight left to dance in, just her and the silence. Ethan turned and walked toward the exit. A few people stopped him. Some offered awkward apologies, others gave respectful nods. None of them had truly seen him before. Now, they couldn't look away, and he hadn't raised his voice once. The valet brought his car around. A simple black sedan. Clean. Unpretentious. It didn't gleam like Chase Whitmore's convertible. It didn't need to. He climbed in, sat quietly for a moment, and placed his hands on the steering wheel as the soft gold of streetlights brushed the windshield. His phone buzzed again. "Delilah, please don't leave yet." He ignored it. Buzz. "Jenna, she just needs a minute." Still nothing. Buzz. "Franklin Monroe, you deserve better. I owe you that much." That one made him smile. Not the kind Delilah used to draw out with illusions, but something more grounded. A smile born of understanding. Because now he knew. Closure doesn't come from those who silenced you. It comes from deciding to speak without needing to shout. He placed the phone beside him and started the engine. As he pulled away from the estate, the city opened up before him. Calm, constant, waiting. No standing ovation. No final act. Just quiet. And Delilah? She would have to live with that silence. Not because he wished her pain, not because he wanted revenge, but because the truth, unraveling her fiction, was the most honest chapter in her story. He wouldn't interrupt it. He wouldn't write her ending. He had already found his own. A man once overlooked, now standing firm. A lie dismantled by two quiet words. Federal prosecutor. No spectacle, no flourish. Just truth at last received.